Thank you for considering teaching this inquiry on the history of people with learning disabilities. It comprises a pupil booklet divided into 8 lessons, a teacher guide summarising core knowledge and giving ideas on how best to teach it, and this PowerPoint presentation, which can be used alongside the booklet in lessons. The unit has been developed in collaboration with professional historians, expert teachers, and, of course, people with learning disabilities themselves. In this presentation, I plan to move sequentially through each lesson, answering the questions pupils might answer. By listening to this and reading the pupil booklet and teacher guide, you can be sure you're well prepared. Even if you are not delivering this unit, I hope you find this presentation interesting. My interest is personal. I have a daughter with a genetic condition, Williams syndrome, which, along with many gifts, brings lifelong learning disability. Curious about how her life might have been had she lived at different times in the past, I began learning and then writing. What I discovered was sometimes tragic, sometimes uplifting, but always fascinating. I was struck by how hidden this history was and thought this wrong. People with learning disabilities have the same rights to be known as anyone else. This is important to know because it reveals much about past societies too. In Lesson 1 of the inquiry, pupils learn what it's all about. A learning disability, for the purposes of this inquiry, is defined as a condition that causes people to be slower to learn than others, which can't be fixed by a specific intervention, and in fact shouldn't be fixed by a specific intervention because it's part of who someone is rather than a problem that they should overcome. People have learning disabilities for a range of different reasons. Sometimes it's a genetic condition like Williams syndrome, which my daughter has, or Down syndrome. Sometimes it can be caused by an accident, and sometimes we just don't know the reason. But it's not uncommon. Many people in our society and in past societies have what we would call a learning disability. This is partially what makes it difficult to define a learning disability, because when we do define a learning disability, we are always comparing one person to another. So it's comparative. There is no binary distinction. If we compared ourselves to Albert Einstein, we probably would all be considered to have a learning disability. Or if someone with a learning disability today lived in a society in which other qualities were valued and there were jobs and roles they could meaningfully and purposefully do, they might not have been regarded as having any disability at all. It's important that pupils learn that this isn't a fixed thing. It kind of depends where you're standing. It's difficult to learn about the experiences of people with learning disabilities, firstly because many people with learning disabilities are not literate, struggle to read and write, which means we don't have many records. But it's not just that. If you think about it, there are many groups in past societies who have struggled to read and write, and we do know more about them. The other answer is a lack of interest. People who create historical records, and then the historians who create work based on these, often write about the things that they are interested in, and for whatever reason, people with learning disability have not been the subject of much scholarly interest. Their voices are there, we can see them, but they're harder to find and we must hunt. It's difficult, but in some ways that's what makes an inquiry like this so satisfying. In Lesson 2, pupils learn about what the evidence tells us about how far people with learning disabilities might have been included in the prehistoric period. The lesson is kind of framed around these two images. On the left, we have an image of a prehistoric band of people hunting a mammoth, and on the right, we have a skull. More on that later. The prehistoric period spans a vast stretch of time. And is divided into 3 parts: the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic. And pupils need to understand that this is a huge period of time. Pupils also need to understand that life during the prehistoric period was difficult. It was hard. We didn't live at the center of the universe in the way we kind of feel like we do today. We were right on the margins with bigger, badder predators around us too. And food was scarce. The climate was difficult, and that meant that quick decision making was very important, and everyone in a community would be expected to contribute to help. Now, that might lead us to think that people with learning disabilities would have struggled to keep up, and actually their survival may not have been prioritized at a time when people needed everybody in a community to be firing on all cylinders and pulling together. However, the skull suggests that this might not always have been the case. The skull on the previous slide reveals the child, who might have been as old as 12, had a condition which caused their brain to develop in an atypical way. The child would certainly have looked distinctive because the skull was a different sort of shape to that of a typically developing child, and it could well have caused learning disabilities. It's important here to understand the child had survived to at least 5 and possibly as old as 12. And that means that if they did have learning disabilities, they were cared for and looked after at a time where resources would have been very hard to find. This suggests that people with learning disabilities may have been included in societies, in prehistoric societies, at least sometimes. I find this personally extremely heartening and uplifting too. The idea that right back at the dawn of human history, we may have evidence that we were looking after people who needed to be supported. In the following lesson, pupils learn about how far people with learning disabilities may have been included in ancient Greece and Rome. This is a tough lesson, and much of what is included here is not pleasant. The first thing to understand is that ancient Greek law, and indeed some Roman laws, said that imperfect babies, so these were babies that did not develop typically, could be legally murdered. Usually this took place by exposing them and leaving them outside in the elements to die. This exposes quite stark and sometimes, to modernize, very unpleasant attitudes. They believed that intelligence and beauty were divine gifts sent by the gods, and that anybody who was what they would call ugly, monstrous in ancient Rome, or developed differently in terms of their intellectual development, was regarded as being cursed by the gods, and that meant that they had a really, really rough time. However, despite this unpleasantness, there is a good chance that people considered to have learning disabilities today might not have been noticed as much as they are in the modern world. And this was because there were probably jobs in which people with learning disabilities could contribute. I'm thinking about things like farming and labouring work, which would have been much more common at this time. And if they could do those jobs, there is a good chance that they would have blended in among the general population without being noticed. They might have regarded as being odd or amusing or funny, but still regarded as being part of society. Towards the end of the Roman period, we have the increasing Christianization of society. And I think it's fair to say that this does begin to change attitudes. The Bible says that it is good to look after those weaker than you and that people should be supported. There is a passage in the Bible that also says the feeble-minded should be supported. Now, of course, we wouldn't use a phrase like that today, but it's intended to be better, to be progressive, because it's saying that the role of society was to care for people who required care, and that they shouldn't just be left to die or killed as they were sometimes in ancient Greece and Rome. We do know by the collapse of the Roman Empire, infanticide, the murdering of children for any reason, had been made illegal. In lesson 4, we push beyond the ancient period and move towards the medieval and early modern society. Tudor and Stuart period, which many school children are familiar with, is part of the early modern period. 2 pictures on the left, which I will come back to later, show Will Sommer, who was one of Henry VIII's innocent fools. And on the right, you have a depiction of a changeling. And I'll come back to that in just a moment too. It's important to understand that in medieval society, people had been taught and believed that everybody was equal in the sight of God. This doesn't mean that such principles were always enacted. It doesn't mean it was some sort of utopia for people with all sorts of disabilities, but it meant there was a principle that said that, to keep with Christian teachings in the Bible, people with disabilities should be included as far as possible. Most people with learning disabilities lived in their communities. There wasn't really a sense that people with any sort of disability should be separated, no sense of being put in an institution or a hospital or anywhere else. They were regarded as part of the communities they lived in. They might have been regarded as funny sometimes, and people may have felt sorry for them if they struggled to learn things as fast as others. But there really was no sense that they should be separated or should live apart or should be anywhere else. We do have some odd ideas around changelings too, which may have been used to explain why some people looked different, developed atypically. A changeling was a belief that fairies or another supernatural being had replaced a human baby with a different sort of baby. People often were fearful that this would happen to them, and there were all sorts of legends around these stories. But we also know that parents who had supposedly changeling children looked after them for many, many years, and it's difficult to believe they would have done this if they didn't love them, care for them, and saw them as important. And finally, we have one of the most interesting aspects of this whole unit. Rich nobles, kings and queens, sometimes adopted innocents or natural fools. Now, these were people who today probably would be regarded as having learning disabilities, and they lived with a rich family or in the king or queen's court and were provided with care, clothes, and help. In exchange for being a sort of curiosity. Sometimes these people were valued for their supposed ability to speak the truth without artifice, because they weren't believed to be capable of misleading. And they could actually have some status. Will Sommer, who I referred to earlier, who was one of Henry VIII's fools, there is some evidence that suggests he was able to intercede on the behalf of a noble who had angered Henry and had all his property taken away and been thrown in jail, and that Will Sommer was able to persuade Henry to change his mind and restore some of the property back to this noble. Um, all of this really is encapsulated by the idea of inclusion, a kind of belief that yes, people may have been odd, and yes, people may have been funny, but people were odd and funny for all sorts of reasons, and they had a right to live with everybody else. There was no sense that they should be separated or forced to live apart, unless they were regarded as being genuinely too dangerous. And even then, it would only be if there were people from their community or family who weren't able to look after them. Lesson 5 moves pupils beyond the early modern period and into the 18th century, 1700s. It's my favourite lesson in the whole inquiry because of the way it's focused on two fascinating personal stories. Those of Fanny First and Thomas, who was accused of taking part in a riot. Fanny's story begins with a baby born into a rich family living near Bath. It soon became clear that this baby was not developing in the typical way that other children developed in. By the age of 22, she didn't know her left from her right. She didn't know the value of money, needed to be helped doing things like dressing, and had to be protected from dangers like the garden pond. Most delightfully, there is a lovely source about how, delighted by a thunderstorm, she turned to her friends and asked them to do it again, talking about the bolt of lightning. Fanny was reasonably well protected by a family who were rich and a mother who certainly loved her very much, but she came to the attentions of an army lieutenant called Bowerman, who realised that were he to marry her, he would be able to take her fortune. He tricked her by promising her strawberries and cream and took her to France, where initially he was not able to find a priest willing to conduct the service because it was clear that Fanny didn't really know what was going on. In the end, however, he managed to get an English priest so drunk that he agreed to perform the ceremony. We can only imagine what poor Fanny's mother went through. But she certainly wasn't idle. Fanny's mother hired 3 investigators and sent them to France, where they enlisted some French cavaliers, and they searched out and found Fanny, removed her from the villainous Bowerman, and took her back home to the care of her mother. Bowerman didn't give up. He claimed that Fanny had only seemed like she had learning disabilities because her mother was always giving her strong drink. The court rejected this absolutely ridiculous defence and returned Fanny to the care of her mother, who very reluctantly agreed to have Fanny declared a legal idiot, which meant that she would be able to have legal guardianship over her. The reasons Fanny's mother was so reluctant to do this was And we have the direct words from herself, was she had such love for her daughter that she didn't want to embarrass her. She just wanted to look after her. Again, I think this is a wonderful story of evidence of inclusion. The idea that despite the fact that people with learning disabilities like Fanny were vulnerable then, there were still people and families and a legal system that was working to try and protect them while trying to include them. Remember as well that Fanny was returned to the care of her mother. There was no suggestion that she should be put away in a hospital or a home or anywhere else. Thomas's story is just as fascinating. Thomas was a skin gatherer in a London meat market. That meant it was his job to pick up all of the skins of animals after they'd been taken off and gather them together to then be processed and resold. We know his life was no paradise, no utopia. We know he was often teased. We knew he was often kind of abused and laughed at by the people around him. Thomas was also fond of a drink and easily led, and at one point he managed to get himself involved in a riot called the Gordeston riots. He was seen by lots of witnesses and, like all the other people caught in the riot, was summoned to appear at court. This was extremely serious, and Thomas's life was at stake. He could be hanged. But things get rather interesting. We have records from the court which shows that witness after witness after witness, including his mother, his employer, some of his friends, all stood up and all claimed that Thomas had been with them at the time of the riot, so he could not have been involved in it. The stories were completely inconsistent. Thomas couldn't possibly have been with everybody at the same time, but they stuck by their stories. Even when the judge said to them, be careful, you're perjuring yourself, you too could end up in trouble. They just repeated their evidence and said, well, we're being very careful, and he was with us. Again, this is real encouraging evidence of inclusion, of the fact that right back then, people were willing to risk their own lives for someone they knew might or probably didn't really understand what was going on when he was involved in the riot. As I said before, Thomas's life was no paradise. We know he was teased. We know that people laughed at him, and we know his job was not the most pleasant job in the world. But the heartening thing here is that when push came to shove and Thomas's life was at stake, the people around him, his community, knew that he was one of their own. You'll have noticed that during the medieval, early modern, and then in the 1700s, society's attitudes towards people with learning disabilities were actually quite inclusive. They might have been regarded as odd, they might have been teased, they might have been regarded as amusing, but they certainly were regarded as part of the societies they lived in, and there was very little suggestion that they didn't have a right to live with everybody else. This begins to change in the 19th and 20th centuries as people begin locking away people with learning disabilities. And in this lesson, pupils learn why that happens. An important reason for this was a bastardization of Charles Darwin's ideas on evolution. Charles Darwin himself talked about natural selection, but didn't place animals or any other creatures in a kind of hierarchy with some being better than others. He certainly didn't do that with humans, and actually explicitly avoided talking about humans when he talked about evolution and natural selection. However, others filled in gaps, joined dots that weren't there. They linked Charles Darwin's ideas to older ideas about a great chain of being, with the idea that there were some lower, more basic, more base creatures and some more advanced and more sophisticated creatures. And some people began to apply this to human beings, and this gives the dubious bad science justification for race and attitudes towards race that emerge at this time too. It was also applied to humans. People with learning disabilities for the first time became regarded as inferior, not as good, and not having as much of a right to exist in society. And people began to look for ways to lock them away, to separate them. People with learning disabilities were increasingly placed in institutions, hospitals, or what were called hospitals at the time, asylums, workhouses. They were increasingly removed from their communities, were no longer allowed to live in them with everyone else. Sometimes these attempts or efforts were more well-meaning than others. For example, the idea of colonies in which people would work, doing work they could do, were supposed to be more progressive than ideas of cruel asylums and institutions. but they were all based on the idea of segregation, of moving people away from the communities they'd once lived in. It's important to understand, and this happens not just with people with learning disabilities, but people in general, that if you separate people away and lock them up, you make them much more vulnerable because you remove them from everyday life. And that means that people don't know them and they aren't thinking about them. It means that you can begin taking steps that you otherwise would never take because you'd see them as cruel or repulsive. And it means that other people aren't as strong in standing up against these things because they don't know people who have the conditions it affects. I mean, I suppose what I'm saying here is out of sight, out of mind. The idea that if we can't see them, we're not thinking about them. And if we're not thinking about them, they're in danger. Lesson 7. Why did some societies in the 20th century try to get rid of people with learning disabilities? This is undoubtedly the most upsetting and affecting lesson in the unit, and pupils might need a bit of care around this, and we might need to make sure that we have the right environment and that it's a kind, safe space before this lesson is taught. The answer to that question is really in the picture on the left, the idea of eugenics, which then is most fully expressed in Nazi Germany. Eugenic societies built on this bastardized version of Darwin's work, which I discussed in reference to the last lesson, but they had aims to try and increase the number of desirable characteristics in human beings and reduce characteristics that they believed were undesirable. Now, these ideas had existed for thousands of years, but had always been applied to animals before. It's the idea of allowing better animals to breed together and not allowing inferior animals to breed together, and by doing so you get bigger, stronger cows and horses and everything else. Well, eugenic societies argue that these same principles should be applied to humans, and this was extremely bad news, devastating news for people with learning disabilities, because of course their characteristics, that characteristic of learning slower than others, was regarded as undesirable, and so their right to have children, their right to exist, came to be questioned. There's a growing belief people with learning disabilities should not exist because people are eugenic societies and those sympathetic to their ideas, and there are a lot of these people. They believe that people with learning disabilities posed a threat to human advancement. The idea being that if someone with learning disabilities had children, well, those children would be more likely to have learning disabilities, and that would mean that over time, people became, or human beings became, less intelligent, less advanced. And so there's this fear of people with learning disabilities, the idea that they should really not exist at all. And certainly if they do exist, they should be kept separate from the rest of society. It's really important to understand that these ideas were not exclusive to Nazi Germany and did not originate in Nazi Germany. Eugenic societies existed in Britain, existed in America, and were mainstream and influential. Lots of famous people who most of you watching this video would have heard of were members of these societies, but these eugenic ideas are most fully expressed in Nazi Germany. The T4 program was the concerted and deliberate attempt by the Nazi state to eradicate people with learning disabilities from German society at all. Many of the same techniques used in the Holocaust against Jews and other people the Nazis deemed undesirable were enacted on people with learning disabilities, gas chambers, mass shootings. It's interesting to note here that this doesn't succeed and fails even before the end of World War II. Or is certainly forced into secrecy by the outrage and the protests of many religious people, but also the families of people with learning disabilities who discovered what was happening or what had happened to their loved ones in what was supposedly hospitals. It's important to note here that the Nazis were secretive about this. They weren't open. The discovery of what was going on in Nazi Germany with the T4 program, the full extent of it only happened at the end of World War II. But it did cause a palpable wave of disgust and abhorrence. People were repelled by this idea, and that meant that mainstream support for eugenics, the idea that people should be prevented from living, should be killed because they had learning disabilities, collapsed. That view disappeared. It is important to notice, though, that this was not replaced by a big pro-surge of positivity towards people with learning disabilities. If anything, it was replaced with indifference, lack of attention. And that means that although people are no longer as clearly vocal about exterminating people with learning disabilities, their lives remain extremely difficult in the period following the end of World War II. Following the end of World War II, many people, particularly those people with profound or complex learning disabilities, were moved into the care of the NHS in hospitals. This sounds appropriate in some ways and sounds quite nice until you unpack what's going on here. It's important to note again that people with learning disabilities are not ill. There is nothing wrong with them. It is part of who they are. By placing people with learning disabilities in hospitals, society was effectively medicalizing these people and casting them as problems that needed to be fixed. It was also handing over care of people who saw things through medical lenses, medical eyes, and they weren't equipped to look after these people, even if they were well intentioned. And this made the NHS hospitals that people lived in grim places. A picture on the left shows the sort of medicalized, sterile, and I think inappropriate care of people with learning disabilities in Britain. The picture on the right isn't from Britain, it's from Greece, but it shows a shocking expose of the conditions inside a hospital in which people with learning disabilities were being housed in ancient Greece. The conditions in NHS hospitals for people with learning disabilities did shock the public. Increasingly, journalists and other inquiring politicians began to become concerned about what was going on in these hospitals. And when details leaked out, people were horrified. There are some deeply upsetting stories. A group of people with learning disabilities put inside effectively a cage on a hot day with no water and observed trying to tunnel their way out. People punished and having privileges like their family visiting them removed for so-called bad behaviour, when often the behaviour was simply refusing to comply with rules that should never have been placed on them in the first place. Children with learning disabilities were often refused an education. There is a particularly disturbing phrase which is used, which is the idea of being ineducable. That meant that if anyone had an IQ below 50, the idea was that they weren't capable of education. Their parents were encouraged to send them away to an institution. Try again for another one to forget was a phrase that was common at this time. And if they did choose to keep them at home and fought to do that because they loved them, as many parents did, the state told them, well, you're not going to get any help with your child's education because they are incapable of learning. Attitudes began to change, partially because of the exposés and the palpable disgust people felt at the conditions in these NHS hospitals. Also because of evidence dating back to World War II, where people with learning disabilities had been drafted into help in sometimes dangerous situations in the war, carrying stretchers and sometimes working in clearing refuge, bomb damage and things from bombs. And so the idea was that actually people with learning disabilities may well have things to contribute that we didn't think them capable of before. We also have the work of campaigning families and people with learning disabilities themselves, which began to question societal attitudes and say there is no reason to write people with learning disability off. They are capable of learning, they are capable of contributing, and they have the same right to live in society as everyone else. And remember, this was a right that existed not too long ago. The medieval period and the early modern period, nobody was arguing that people with learning disabilities shouldn't be part of their communities. However, having said that, it's very fair to conclude the unit by saying we have a long way to go, and The outcomes for people with learning disabilities, like my daughter, still dire. Employment rates are absolutely shocking. Life expectancy is years lower than it is for people with without learning disabilities, even when you control for associated health conditions. And finally, as everyone watching this video will know, we were all shocked and stunned to learn about the disgrace with COVID-19 vaccinations, and the death rate of people with learning disabilities being up to 6 times as high as those without. Having said that, it's not to say there isn't hope. There is. Yes, things are better for many people with learning disabilities than they have been many times in the past. Nobody mainstream is arguing for their extermination. Many live in their own homes, and events like the Special Olympics do a good job of demonstrating people with learning disabilities should have the same opportunities as rights as everyone else. But there is no room for complacency. Not very long ago, modern and technologically advanced societies attempt to systematically murder or eliminate all sorts of people. Eugenic attitudes lurk at the background, and we must guard against them. Teaching children this unit may play a part in building bridges and protect against a recurrence of the horrors of Nazi Germany. I hope you find it interesting and rewarding, and I hope the children you teach do too.